First off, I'm excited to be back. I really liked the first episode, and I almost forgot like how beautiful the show is.
Yeah, and it was pretty striking for them to start off with, trying to show off the prime radiant. Like nobody knows what 4 dimensions would look like, like how do you visualize that?
Yeah, I was like, what is going on? It was very confusing how the episode opened up with Harry just like screaming into a void. Like that's not exactly where I felt like we left Harry. Now we've seen there's 2 Harrys. Even Salvor said there's Harry at the vault.
I wonder if they're going to be different. Hello and welcome to Road Goes Ever On and On. Today, Mark and I are talking about the hit science fiction TV series Foundation, Season 2, Episode 1, In Seldon's Shadow. So spoilers are ahead. And if you're enjoying our content, then a like would be appreciated. If you don't want to miss a single one of our breakdowns, then just be sure to subscribe and click that bell icon for notifications. And with that... What?
I remember going through puberty.
And with that, what did you think kind of coming back to this show? Because it's been a hot second.
First off, I'm excited to be back. I really liked the first episode, and I almost forgot like how beautiful the show is. Like
it's gorgeous.
Yeah, for some reason I feel like, if you like watch a show on Disney Plus, like I feel like everything feels muted. It feels just, it's a TV show, and it like brings it down just a level, just aesthetically. This show is just so beautiful. It feels high budget. The CGI, with the Radiant is beautiful. It's a very pretty show, and I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, and it was pretty striking for them to start off with, trying to show off the prime radiant, which is, I think, kind of an abstract thing. Like nobody knows what 4 dimensions would look like. Like how do you visualize that? And I thought that was a very kind of striking and beautiful way to start off. I love that. I love the aesthetic of the show. I think that, science fiction like this can sometimes be very tough because it relies on a lot of pronouns, and that can be tough to juggle all of that. There's like all of these foreign places, all of these foreign names, foreign science concepts of, their technology or whatever. And so I think that can be tough to manage all of that. And then in addition to that, when you go from one season to another, and so you've forgotten a lot of this information, it can be tough to kind of pick up. But it's interesting that I think because there's this big time jump, there's not going to be that same huge cast. We are still following some of the same people, but they're like the core people that I think we were super familiar with. So like some of the kind of more minor names, we don't quite have to deal with. And I felt like it was only, even though this is pretty sprawling, like I felt like it was focused on just like a few small areas, which for me, it felt like it was very easy to jump back into.
I agree. Completely agree with that. I thought, because I think it's been about almost 2 years since we've watched this, maybe like a year and a half. And I did think that since we were picking up in a similar fashion to like they had a big time jump, we have a big time jump. And like you were saying, like there is a lot of things that we kind of talked about that happened last season, with what happened on Terminus and the Foundation and, the Invictus, which kind of, we're doing our own thing in this season already. Like we're already off on our own paths, but, it did kind of do a little bit of a refresher. One thing I really liked was in the first season, I think you and I both commented that the fight scenes were a little fake looking. Like they just didn't seem like they were really fighting. It was like very choreographed and kind of not choreographed well. Yeah. And I think in the beginning of this episode, when we saw Cleon get attacked, I think that like was such a great action set piece that we didn't get in the last season. And it gets me really excited for this season of Foundation.
Absolutely. And so I felt like this was a nice way to kind of get into it. We've got, good action. It's interesting that it's kind of like a mix of, you can tell that some of the previous stories do matter, but also they're bringing in some kind of new stories, with like what's going on with Cleon and, the person that he's considering marrying. There's like a whole new thing with that, like Dominion that was brought up. We'll get into that kind of later. But I feel like this was a really good kind of jumping into way of doing it, of keeping it a few simple stories, people that we really remember, and then kind of building up from there. I didn't feel like I needed a huge, recap in order to kind of remember exactly what was going on.
Right. The only thing I think I am having trouble remembering is where did the Invictus end up? But it ended up with the Foundation, right? The Foundation has the Invictus.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. That was the only thing I couldn't really remember, and I was afraid to look anything up in case of spoilers of the season, so I just I said I'll just ask Sterling, maybe he remembers. And I was I remember the Invictus was jumping, and then that one guy sacrificed himself to jump the Invictus and gain control of it, and I couldn't remember where it landed, but now I think Foundation, that's correct.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, Terminus, yeah.
Okay, cool. So, getting that out of the way, jumping in with Cleon, I think that this was an interesting version of Cleon. Like we saw, it's been a generation or two of Cleon. So the ones that we saw previously aren't even the Dawn that we saw previously, who did die and was decanted into a new Dawn. We're not even seeing him as Dusk. It's completely new Cleons. We know from the first season that there was that organization that was manipulating their DNA. And I think that with this Cleon and him marrying into Dominion, it's showing that tampering with that DNA has created this break off of them being just three clones that continuously rule.
Right. I love this performance because he has to, all of the actors that are portraying it, Dawn, Day, and Dusk do a fantastic job of playing these kind of versions of themselves. And there are definitely, subtle differences between them, and some of them maybe not quite as subtle, but I did like this time jump in seeing, I feel like it really accelerated the problems from the DNA being tampered with. And so we really got to see kind of the ramifications of it. This day kind of reminds me of, I think a lot of this kind of reminds me of the Roman Empire. I said that from season 1. But this kind of reminds me of a bunch of Roman emperors were killed. And so I think that there was definitely paranoia among them. And it definitely reminds me of some of those kind of paranoid emperors, who don't trust anybody. It's wild that he doesn't even trust, the other, his brothers.
Which is so different from the first season because, we didn't have the DNA tampering thing occurring. So he was very trustful of his brothers. They did have a little distrust of Dawn, but he was the first tampered DNA Cleon. So, it makes sense why now a generation or two later, they don't trust each other. And I think that will also play into these crises that we're seeing, that these Cleons aren't trusting each other. And eventually it's going to be like the Roman Empire. It's going to fall.
Right. Yeah, and I just really kind of like seeing, how they're struggling with these themes of death and the legacy that you kind of leave. And it's interesting that it's kind of different from before, whereas before I think the Cleons wanted to each leave something, but I think I think the fact that they were this singular legacy, I don't think that they had that same necessarily fear of death, maybe up until like right in the end. But I didn't see this like, existential kind of aspect that we're seeing now where, Day is considering kind of breaking the legacy and wanting to create his own heir, and having maybe that rule on. And it's just kind of interesting, this kind of like existential aspect and how that's kind of crept in. And he also said something about like feeling like he's like a singular individual or something like that. So, I think he feels separate and different and unique from the others, which means that like, does that solve the whole luminism thing of like only an individual can have a soul, which is why like it was implied that Empire didn't have a soul.
Right, because he was constantly a clone and not the true essence of a soul. But I think that we did start to see that in season 1 with that version of Dawn, where he was starting to feel like he was his own thing, right? Like he was the best hunter because he had better vision, and he started to fall in love with somebody that wasn't, like not like his brothers were falling in love. We also see that Day was, shacking up with Demerzel, which apparently is not a thing that the Cleons had done except since the first Cleon. And it shows this whole different, like even the pierced ears that Day had. It just shows that this is a completely different Day. It like maybe this Day has a soul. Maybe they, based on luminism, maybe he doesn't. It is interesting, and I think we're going to see some really cool brotherly clone dynamics in this season, which I'm excited for.
Yeah. Other great dynamics, I felt like I love the interplay between like Gaal and Salvor.
Yes.
Because that's a very kind of unique and complicated relationship. And I love the way it was portrayed.
Yeah, and it's we didn't get a lot of their interaction in the last season. It was completely two separate storylines that we followed, which I think, I like both of these actresses and them playing off each other. And, I liked that we feel, Salvor, I feel, has been like searching for a place to belong. And in her finding Gaal, she's kind of like found like, okay, well, this is where I really come from. Maybe this will connect some pieces. And then like Gaal, who has had no knowledge of Salvor, is just like, this is way too trippy for me. Like hopefully we can get there, but they do share this common like problem of that, they've been in cryosleep for hundreds of years. And so they'd have
everyone they've ever loved. Yeah.
Gone. It's a very cool dynamic.
It is. And I really like the way that, that Gaal put it, when Salvor was kind of disappointed about the way that it went, and Gaal said the thing about like, you've been thinking about this for quite some time and how this would happen. Like, I just learned this, so it's like, she just needs a little bit of time to process it. It was a really cool situation that like science fiction could have happened that, would be tough to kind of have happen in the real world. Like meeting your daughter who is probably older than you. And also you didn't know that you had a daughter.
Right. That in itself is a total mind trip. I also like to see the way that they interact and solve problems together. I know we only got a small taste of it, but I think it is a taste of what is to come. Like them trying to raise this thing, they could really only do it together. Like Gaal, who has the ability to hold her breath very long because she's Synaxian, has the ability to get down there but doesn't know how to start a ship. And Salvor, who would never be able to hold her breath long enough to raise the ship. Like, so it does create this interesting dynamic that I'm sure we'll see play out further.
Yeah, I think they're also both very smart, but also in different ways. Like Gaal is amazing with mathematics, and not that Salvor isn't, because I assume that she being raised in the Foundation, I'm sure that she experienced a lot and like learned a lot. But she seems like she's a little bit more like instinctual, and she was, protecting like the perimeter. And so I think that she is kind of very smart about like the physical world and like how to interact with things in that way. And so I think this is going to be a great pairing, and the two of them can really do a lot. It's like, it's interesting that the Prime Radiant, this wasn't the way that it was supposed to go, and so it looks like it's potentially created a lot more problems. But this also seems like a great pairing of people that could forge a new path that, who knows, maybe is even better than the original one, that Harry was trying to go for.
Yeah, and I liked that we, in the first season, we saw examples of this, of Gaal seeing the future and Salvor seeing the past, but I didn't really like connect it was like future and past, where to me it was just like, oh, they both have visions and they both can kind of understand. Same. And I think in this episode, it really made it like it basically told us to our face that one sees the future, one sees the past. And I think that with that and their special abilities where Salvor can detect lying, more instinctual, more numbers-based Gaal, like I think that they are going to be very important for the outcome of humanity.
Yeah, and I do like the inclusion of, religion, the powers, whatever it is that's in there. Like, I do generally like that stuff to be distinct for me, like fantasy and fantasy, science fiction and science fiction. This kind of feels like a little bit of a cross between the two, because clearly Gaal and Salvor have some kind of abilities. To me, it does seem like that's potentially tied with the seer religion, that they come from. So like maybe there's some truth to that. There is a vision that does happen at the end of the spiral. So like that does seem like it is a legit, like there is some legitimacy to maybe even that religion. And that also kind of reminds me of a lot of the religions in that time where there were multiple gods that were all kind of doing things together, instead of just like monotheistic groups, like it does seem like there might be truth to both the Mother, the Maiden, the Crone, and maybe like this seer thing, and who knows, maybe some other things. And so it's just kind of interesting seeing that, like, that aspect in a science fiction thing way in the future in space.
Oh yeah, no, I love the dynamics of the philosophy of the show, of just like what it means to be a person, what it like your beliefs mean in this world, especially like when you have things that can, create, or like with Demerzel of her existence, like she's an android, but is she a soul? Like, does it, like I love the dynamics of this. I like that now we are seeing in Harry Seldon's point of view, like the consciousness, which was very confusing at first, how the episode opened up with Harry just like screaming into a void. Like that's not exactly where I felt like we left Harry. He seemed like very much like at the vault, and he was sending Salvor on her mission. So this version of Harry, I was like, what is going on? It was very confusing. But then seeing him kind of like break out of that, and it was almost like, and we got a little glimpse of what Harry went through as a child. Like, it doesn't seem like he had the best upbringing. And I'm curious if we'll explore that more.
I do have a feeling that we will. It seems odd to me that it would just be like this weird one-off. And they have brought up his homeworld before, so it does seem like his past might be important. So I definitely think we'll get glimpses of it. But I really thought it was a really cool representation, showing like the inside of the Prime Radiant, because once again, this is like something that I don't know if you can really comprehend. Like, if nobody knows what 4 dimensions looks like, if you're not talking about like time is like the 4th dimension. And so how do you describe that in a 3-dimensional world? Like, how do you kind of portray that? And so I liked this kind of like the different tricks that they did in order to do that, you know, as far as like, first off, having it be kind of black and whitish, you know, especially in the beginning with like a strong lighting source, which made it hard to see anything else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it was almost like a void. But then there's like all these like sharp angles and whatever. And there was, you know, an interesting moment where he like climbs out of something and you can see he goes from like one orientation to another orientation. So I thought that they did a pretty good job of depicting that kind of like abstract idea.
Yeah, no, and I also really liked when he was like walking on like the stairs that weren't like at a right angle. Like we came at it one way and then another way, and his feet never really landed on a step. They were kind of in between steps. I think that the representation of it was great. Now, this consciousness that speaks to Harry, that claims that it is the Prime Radiant's consciousness, it's work from the his wife, and I forget the other one's name. Calais,
yes,
was the author of the Ninth Proof, and I'm assuming they worked on this Prime Radiant a little bit. You know, I don't think we heard much in the first season about Harry's wife.
Yeah,
and do you think that this consciousness in the Prime Radiant, does it have good intentions in the scheme of humanity, or does it have negative intentions?
You know, my guess is that it would have positive intentions. Because just kind of based off of the people it was born from, the way that they kind of portrayed Yana, it's clear that that was like a loving relationship. I do get that it's like, it started with those three, and then it's potentially grown from there. So it's possibly even more than like what they invented. But I do think that it will be mostly positive. If it has any of like Harry in it, I think that it might unfortunately think about things from kind of like a utilitarian perspective, you know, and think about like the greater good and not necessarily care as much about the individual.
I mean, maybe. I am going back and forth with the morality of the Prime Radiant. And the one thing that made me think about it was when Harry first questioned it, and it was like, you're trying to make me feel like your friend. That's like an interrogation.
Yeah.
Which also could make me feel that if the Prime Radiant we'll say the Prime Radiant adopted Harry's outlook, mentality, and wants to trick Harry like Harry tricked Gaal. And so it poses itself as these two people that Harry could trust, you know, Yana and Calais. And plus the final sentence that he says where he says, you know, oh, I have an interest in the destiny of humanity. Yeah. And he's like, you mean the survivability of humanity? Yeah. And she's like, isn't that the same? And I just don't...
The Prime Radiant would know that's not the same.
Yeah, I do feel like the Prime Radiant might have some diabolical intent. Now, we see at the end, we see Harry pop up in the ship. Is that... Yeah. And that's the one that we saw fighting with... not fighting with, but speaking with the Prime Radiant. Yeah. I'm confused how he got out. I don't know if you understand. I know that, like, the Prime Radiant, like, led him out, but, like, the Prime Radiant is that item, correct?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Okay, that's... Yeah. So... Gaal
put him in the Prime Radiant.
Right. So
because they were in the ship together.
Right. So how does he get out of the Prime Radiant if she doesn't let him out? I'm sure maybe the Prime Radiant let it out, but do you think there's anything more to that?
I don't think there's more to that. I think that's what they kind of alluded to, of like he couldn't figure out how to get out, and it was like way too tough on his brain to think in extra dimensions. And that's when she kind of nudged him to remembering that you can see a representation of three-dimensional space in two dimensions. And so I think that like he could work with the shadow, like the three-dimensional shadow of this, and be able to understand those dimensions in order to like unlock it and get out. So I think that was kind of like his aha moment that allowed him to then let himself out.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of how I took that.
Now, we've seen there's two Harrys. Even Salvor
Yes.
said there's Harry at the vault, Harry at...
I wonder if they're going to be different
That's what
because of their experiences.
That's what I was curious about. Will this Harry not know who Salvor Hardin is? Where the Harry at the vault does know Salvor. So I'm curious if it's going to... Like, so say when he's in the vault, can he be accessing the Prime Radiant? Or same with when he was in the vault in the ship? Are there ways to transfer knowledge from one instance to another? I don't know if there is.
Is there a way? Would they want to? Like, if their experiences make them who they are, you know, I mean, we're getting into some Severance stuff, you know? Like,
I know.
Like, what, you know, if you have, like, individual wants, what would happen if you kind of merge those two? Like, how do you reconcile those? You know, because their experiences seem very different. You know, this Harry is like a very angry Harry versus I think the other Harry, I think, seemed like he was just continuing forward with like the situation that happened, just possibly like accepting it and kind of figuring out like, okay, well, what do I need to do next?
Do we think that those Harrys will eventually meet each other?
I think so.
I think so too. I think what we saw with the vault starting to open up again, I think that was a really cool thing to see, like Terminus doing its own thing, a new cast of people on Terminus because it's 130 some odd years later.
Also, I love that the actor that is playing the warden on
Who
there.
is that?
Don't know his name, but he was in a great 2-season show on Netflix called Mindhunter. That's all about like I think the FBI
with all the serial killers.
The group that formed to deal with serial killers. He's one of the two main characters in it, and just absolutely phenomenal. Yeah,
well, I'm excited that they cast him. I haven't seen much of his work, so I'm excited. But it was cool to see that, you know, that warden and that the vault had like regained its field that was you can't get too close to it, and now that the field is relenting, that it's going to open up again and something's going to come from it. I don't know if we know what we're going to see from there, but I am excited this season to find out. And it seems probably sooner rather than later.
And it's interesting that that like Terminus has exploded, you know, because when they first got there, it was a very inhospitable world. And so it was tough for them to just kind of set up. And so I think now that, you know, over 100 years has happened, you know, they've managed to kind of like deal with a lot of this instead of being like, it used to be almost like just an encampment. Right.
I remember. And they were always talking about like in the beginning that it was like 40% of their population wasn't going to survive. So it's great to see that they're thriving. It's great to see that they've been under the radar of Cleon, the Empire.
Right.
Which I do love. Like, I know that when we were watching it with like what was going down with Terminus and what was going down with on Trantor with all the different, you know, clones, Dawn trying to escape and the other Dawn, I think that it didn't outwardly explain it in the first season, and maybe it did, it's been a while, but why they didn't like know what was going on with Terminus. And this was a great little explainer to be like, well, we were busy worrying about this clone thing that we kind of let Terminus go under the radar.
Oh, yeah. And I do kind of like that, like, so last season, there was a lot of heavy lifting that needed to happen of what is the Foundation and how do we create the Foundation? How do we deal with, you know, setting it up on this like crappy world? And it took a long time to get to the first crisis. which is like the first test of the Foundation, versus this season, a lot of that heavy lifting is done. And now it's like the second crisis is upon us,
which is going to lead to more and more crises. I do think that it's cool that the stakes feel raised in this season already.
Yes.
First episode right out the gate, instead of one crisis we have to deal through, we got to figure out this next one. Otherwise, it's going to ripple effect to potentially infinite crises.
Right. Yeah, that's wild. One last thing I want to say about like the beauty of this world, and something I thought was kind of interesting. I think Synax has like natural rings on it, and it's a beautiful world. Mm-hmm. I love the idea of creating artificial rings that have a purpose for like moving goods or whatever it is that they're doing. I didn't catch that the first time around. And then the second time, when I could actually kind of like see the rings and see that it's like shipping lanes or something like that. Like that was a cool idea, and like both a utility and also a pretty feature.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that they even describe it with like what Trantor is with those rings around it, and Cleon is like it's beautiful about like what we can do. Like it's not about like necessarily the functionality, but it's like a show of like how much power we have that we can do something like that. And so that is a cool way, like in this Dominion, which I don't know if we trust completely yet. They don't see it that way. And with the juxtaposition of the chroma, right? Like, so
yeah,
the rings are this kind of utilitarian thing that needs to happen, like that we can use functionality, and the chroma, which is this beautiful substance that some ways of extracting this certain blue, it's impossible for it to not fade. And they bring these beautiful colors as like a gift to Empire. I loved seeing that like difference, which means I think we'll see a difference between what Dominion has to bring and what Empire has to bring to the table, and potentially the conflicts that might cause. I'm very excited.
Yeah, and like they've already kind of set the grounds for another interesting mystery. We'll see whether or not they actually unpack it, because like they've alluded to things in the past before and then not gotten to it. Like they alluded to like a robot uprising, and then most of the robots were destroyed because of it, with like Demerzel being possibly like the one exception. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thing that was alluded to that we didn't really get to see. Maybe they'll explore it at some point. But this whole thing with Sereth, it was mentioned that some people believe that she brought about the like accident that put the crown on her head or something like that.
Right.
And that's very intriguing, and then it mentioned that like she's the sole descendant of Dominion, whatever that means. But there are clearly significance in these words. And I wonder if that's just like adding to the rich history of the world, or if that's something that we actually get to see at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like this world does feel very big, fleshed out. It does seem like there is a lot to it. Nothing like shallow or superficial. It all seems grandiose and very lived in, which is very exciting. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah.
But with that, I think our journey has come to an end. Thank you folks so much for joining along. Come back next week, as we will be doing Foundation Season 2, Episode 2 and 3. But until then, I'm Mark. This is Sterling.
Thanks.